how one decision altered the fate of millions forever. The year was 1854, and London was dying. Not slowly, not quietly, but in the most horrific way imaginable. People would wake up healthy, eat breakfast with their families, and be dead by nightfall. The disease showed no mercy. Rich or poor, young or old, it struck with terrifying speed. Victims would experience violent stomach cramps, unstoppable diarrhea, and their bodies would literally dehydrate from the inside out. Their skin would turn blue-gray, their eyes would sink into their skulls, and within hours, they would be gone. They called it cholera, and it had killed tens of thousands across Britain. But nobody knew what caused it. The smartest doctors in the world believed diseases traveled through bad air, poisonous vapors called miasma that rose from rotting garbage and sewage. It seemed logical. After all, poor neighborhoods with terrible smells always had more disease. The connection seemed obvious. Then, one man made a decision that would change everything. Not a king, not a general, not even a famous doctor, but a simple physician named John Snow, who refused to accept what everyone else believed to be true. His choice to investigate one outbreak in one London neighborhood would eventually save more lives than any war has ever taken. The City of Death. London in the 1850s was a city of contrasts. Grand palaces stood blocks away from festering slums. The wealthy rode in polished carriages past children playing in streets running with sewage. The Thames, which had once been a pristine river, had become an open sewer carrying the waste of 3 million people. But Londoners had grown accustomed to the smell, the filth, the ever-present threat of disease. Cholera had first arrived in Britain in 1831, brought from ships from India, where the disease was endemic. It had returned in waves, 1832, 1848-49, and now in 1854, each outbreak more devastating than the last. The disease was terrifying, not just because it killed, but because of how it killed. A person could be laughing at breakfast and writhing in agony by lunch. The violent purging would drain every drop of fluid from the body. Victims' eyes would sink so far back into their skulls that they became unrecognizable. Their fingers would wrinkle as if they'd been soaking in water for days. The skin would turn a ghastly blue-gray color that gave cholera its nickname, the Blue Death. Medical science was helpless. Doctors tried everything: bloodletting, opium, mercury, brandy, electric shocks. Nothing worked. The mortality rate approached 50%. When cholera struck a neighborhood, half the people who contracted it would die. The prevailing medical theory offered a clear explanation. Diseases arose from miasma, bad air created by decomposing organic matter. If you could smell something foul, you were breathing in disease. The theory had been accepted for centuries, endorsed by the greatest medical minds, and taught in every medical school. It explained why poor neighborhoods with open sewers and piles of rotting garbage had more disease than wealthy areas with better sanitation. What the miasma theory couldn't explain were the patterns that troubled John Snow. The skeptical doctor. John Snow was not your typical Victorian physician. Born in 1813 to a working-class family in York, he had worked his way up through sheer determination and intelligence. He became a surgeon's apprentice at 14, witnessing firsthand the cholera outbreak of 1831-32 that killed hundreds in his hometown. Those deaths haunted him. By 1854, Snow had established himself as a respected anesthesiologist in London. He had even administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. But his true passion was understanding cholera. He had published a pamphlet in 1849 arguing that cholera was spread through contaminated water, not air. The medical establishment had largely ignored it. Snow's water theory was based on observation. Cholera always started with violent digestive symptoms, suggesting the poison entered through the mouth, not the lungs. The disease spread along the paths of water supplies and rivers, not randomly through the air. People who drank from certain water sources got sick. Those who didn't stayed healthy. But observation alone wasn't enough to overturn centuries of accepted medical theory. Snow needed proof. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence that would force the medical establishment to listen. On August 31st, 1854, he got his chance.
The outbreak that changed history. Soho, in the heart of London's West End, was a cramped neighborhood where working families lived cheek by jowl in tenement buildings. Tailors, shoemakers, craftsmen, and their families occupied narrow houses on streets barely wide enough for two people to pass. They drew their water from public pumps scattered throughout the neighborhood, gathering there to fill buckets and exchange gossip. On August 31, everything seemed normal. But that evening, a baby girl named Frances Lewis fell ill with terrible diarrhea. Her mother, Sarah Lewis, washed the baby's soiled diapers and dumped the wash water into a cesspool in front of their house at 40 Broad Street. The cesspool was just 3 feet from the public water pump. Within 48 hours, Frances Lewis was dead. Within 3 days, 127 other people on nearby streets were also dead. By September 10th, the death toll had climbed past 500. Panicked residents fled their homes, abandoning entire streets. Those who remained lived in terror, not knowing who would be next. The smell of death hung over Soho like a shroud. Most doctors nodded knowingly when they heard the news. It was obviously miasma from the cesspools and sewers. The Reverend Henry Whitehead, the local Anglican minister, agreed. He had smelled the foul air himself while ministering to the dying. The solution was clear. Burn fires to purify the air, move away from the smell, and wait for the outbreak to pass. John Snow read the reports with growing excitement. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. A contained outbreak in a small area where he could track every case, interview survivors, and finally prove his theory once and for all. He made a decision that his colleagues thought was mad. Instead of theorizing from his office like a proper physician, he would investigate the outbreak like a detective solving a crime. He would map every death, interview every survivor, and follow the evidence wherever it led. On September 3rd, Snow began walking the streets of Soho with a notebook in hand. The detective work that changed medicine. For the next week, John Snow became a man possessed. He knocked on every door, spoke with survivors, and recorded meticulous details about every death. Where exactly did they live? What time did symptoms begin? What did they eat? Where did they get their water? Had they traveled anywhere recently? Every detail mattered. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. What could door-knocking accomplish that medical theory couldn't explain? But Snow persisted, driven by an obsession that consumed his every waking hour. As he plotted each death on a map of Soho, using black bars to represent fatalities at each address, a pattern emerged that made his hands tremble. The deaths weren't random. They weren't evenly distributed. They clustered around a single location, the public water pump on Broad Street. The same pump just feet away from where baby Frances Lewis's mother had dumped contaminated wash water. But the pattern revealed even more than that. Snow discovered anomalies that were impossible to explain with the miasma theory, but made perfect sense with his water theory. A workhouse on Poland Street, right in the middle of the outbreak zone, housed 535 inmates. Only 5 had died. Snow investigated and discovered they had their own private well. they never drank from the Broad Street pump. The Lion Brewery on Broad Street, practically next door to the most affected houses, employed 70 workers. Not a single one had contracted cholera. Snow interviewed the owner and learned that brewery workers were allowed to drink as much beer as they wanted. None of them drank water from the pump. But the most damning evidence came from outside the outbreak area entirely. A woman named Susanna Ailey, living in Hampstead, well beyond Soho, had died from cholera on September 2. It made no sense until Snow interviewed her surviving family. Susanna had grown up in Soho and loved the taste of the Broad Street pump water so much that she had it specially delivered to her home in bottles. She had drunk a bottle of Broad Street water on August 31. Her niece, who visited that day and shared the water, also died. Even more remarkably, Susanna's sons, who lived with her but didn't drink the Broad Street water, remained completely healthy. Snow had found his proof. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Cholera wasn't traveling through the air. It was traveling through the water. Specifically, through the water from the Broad Street pump. The decision that saved a city. On the evening of September 7, 1854, John Snow requested an urgent meeting with the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish. These local officials were responsible for public health in the area, and they were desperate for answers. The death toll was still climbing. Something had to be done. Snow arrived at the meeting carrying his map, his notebooks, and his revolutionary conclusion. He presented his evidence methodically: the clustering of deaths around the pump, the workhouse with its private well, the brewery workers who drank beer instead of water, the woman in Hampstead who had the water delivered. The officials listened in stunned silence. What Snow was proposing contradicted everything they had been taught about disease. He wasn't a famous physician from one of the great medical schools. He had no prestigious endorsements from the Royal College of Physicians. He was just one doctor with a map and a theory that flew in the face of accepted medical wisdom. And his proposed solution seemed absurd. Remove the handle from the Broad Street pump so nobody could use it. The officials faced a moment of decision that would echo through history. They could stick with the miasma theory, endorsed by Britain's most prestigious doctors, spray lime to purify the air, and hope the outbreak would pass naturally. Or they could trust this outsider with his strange map and his radical theory about water. The evidence was compelling, but it was also terrifying. If they removed the pump handle based on Snow's theory and the outbreak continued, they would look like fools who had panicked and deprived residents of their water supply for no reason. If Snow was wrong, their careers would be over. But if he was right, every hour they delayed meant more deaths. After intense debate, the officials made their choice. They would trust the evidence. On September 8, 1854, they ordered the removal of the handle from the Broad Street pump. The outbreak ended almost immediately. New cases of cholera dropped to nearly zero within days. The streets of Soho, which had been nearly deserted, slowly came back to life. Families who had fled began to return. The terror that had gripped the neighborhood began to fade. John Snow had been right, and his decision to investigate that outbreak, combined with the officials' decision to trust his evidence, had just saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. But the battle for acceptance of his theory was only beginning. The fight for truth. Snow's victory should have revolutionized medicine overnight. Instead, it ignited a firestorm of controversy. The medical establishment was outraged. They called his water theory absurd, unscientific, and dangerous. How dare this country doctor contradict centuries of medical wisdom? How dare he undermine the miasma theory that had guided public health policy for generations?
The president of the Medical Society of London publicly ridiculed his ideas at a meeting, calling them nothing more than the hallucinations of a man with a theory to prove. Prestigious medical journals published scathing editorials dismissing his evidence as coincidence. The Lancet, Britain's leading medical journal, suggested the outbreak had simply run its natural course and the pump removal was irrelevant. Even the officials who had removed the pump handle began to waver. Without ongoing deaths to prove the pump was dangerous, pressure mounted to restore water service. A few months later, they reinstalled the handle. The miasma theory was too deeply entrenched, too fundamental to how doctors understood disease. Accepting Snow's theory meant admitting they had been catastrophically wrong about nearly everything. It meant admitting that their treatments, the bloodletting, the purging, the mercury, had been useless or worse. It meant accepting that thousands had died preventable deaths because doctors had looked at air when they should have been looking at water. The psychological resistance was too strong. The medical establishment circled its wagons and fought back with everything it had. Snow spent the next 4 years of his life fighting for his discovery. He published detailed reports analyzing multiple cholera outbreaks. He gathered more evidence, refined his arguments, and demonstrated again and again that contaminated water was the culprit. But the medical establishment refused to budge. They had too much invested in the miasma theory to abandon it based on the work of one maverick doctor. Then, in 1858, London experienced a summer so hot and the Thames became so polluted that the smell became unbearable. Parliament itself was affected. The stench was so overwhelming that members of Parliament soaked their curtains in chloride of lime just to hold sessions. They called it the Great Stink. Suddenly, building a modern sewer system became a political priority. Not because officials believed Snow's theory, most still blamed the miasma, but because the smell was making life in London intolerable. Parliament allocated millions of pounds for an ambitious sewer project designed by engineer Joseph Bazalgette. Ironically, by trying to eliminate bad air, they would accomplish what Snow had been advocating all along, separating drinking water from sewage. But John Snow never lived to see his vindication. On June 16, 1858, at the age of just 45, he suffered a stroke and died. He passed away still largely dismissed by the medical establishment. His revolutionary theory about waterborne disease accepted by a handful of supporters. He had no idea that his decision to investigate the Broad Street outbreak would eventually save more lives than any general who ever lived. The revolution that transformed civilization. In the decades following Snow's death, the scientific world underwent a revolution. Louis Pasteur in France began proving that microscopic organisms caused fermentation and disease. Robert Koch in Germany identified the specific bacteria that caused tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax. The germ theory of disease emerged and rapidly gained acceptance. Suddenly, John Snow's water theory made perfect sense. Cholera was caused by a microscopic organism that traveled through contaminated water. Everything Snow had observed and documented aligned perfectly with the new understanding of disease. Cities around the world began the massive undertaking of building modern water and sewer systems. London completed Joseph Bazalgette's revolutionary sewer network in 1875, featuring 82 miles of main sewers and over 1,000 miles of street sewers. The system separated drinking water from wastewater completely, ensuring that human sewage could never contaminate the water supply. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Before the new sewer system, cholera had swept through London regularly. Major outbreaks in 1832, 1848-49, 1853-54, and 1866. After the sewers were completed, cholera essentially disappeared from London. The last major outbreak occurred in 1866, before the system was fully operational. Other cities watched and learned. New York began construction of its Croton Aqueduct system, bringing clean water from upstate reservoirs.
Chicago made engineering history by raising the entire city several feet and installing comprehensive sewers underneath. Boston, Philadelphia, and other major American cities followed suit. Hamburg, Berlin, and Paris undertook similar projects. Melbourne, Sydney, and other colonial cities built modern water systems from scratch. The impact on public health was staggering. Before clean water systems, cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases were constant threats that could strike any city at any time. Child mortality was horrific. In London in 1850, nearly 60 out of every 100 children died before their 5th birthday. Most of these deaths were from diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated water. After cities implemented clean water and sewer systems based on Snow's principles, death rates plummeted. In London, the infant mortality rate dropped from 60% to under 15% within a generation. Life expectancy jumped from the low 40s to the high 50s by 1900 and kept climbing. Similar improvements occurred in every city that built modern water infrastructure. The economic impact was equally profound. For the first time in human history, cities could grow to unprecedented sizes without collapsing into disease-ridden death traps. The modern metropolis, the industrial economy, the urban civilization we take for granted today, all of it became possible only because we learned to separate clean water from sewage based on principles John Snow fought to establish. A legacy measured in lives saved. Snow's decision to investigate that 1854 outbreak didn't just save British lives. His methodology, using data, mapping patterns, following evidence rather than theory, became the foundation of epidemiology, the science of tracking and preventing disease outbreaks. When yellow fever threatened to derail construction of the Panama Canal in the early 1900s, American doctors used Snow's investigative methods to discover that mosquitoes spread the disease. They eliminated mosquito breeding grounds, and the canal was completed, reshaping global trade. When polio terrorized parents across America in the 40s and 50s, killing and paralyzing thousands of children, epidemiologists used Snow's mapping techniques to track outbreaks and eventually identify how the virus spread. This knowledge paved the way for Jonas Salk's vaccine, which has now nearly eradicated polio worldwide. When HIV/AIDS emerged in the 1980s as a mysterious disease killing gay men and hemophiliacs, the same principle Snow pioneered helped scientists track the disease, identify risk factors, understand transmission routes, and develop prevention strategies that have saved millions of lives. During the COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020, epidemiologists around the world used techniques that traced directly back to Snow's investigation, mapping cases, identifying clusters, tracing contacts, testing hypotheses about transmission, and following the evidence wherever it led.